Hi students, I want to go through the period 6 review with you. I think you have a good understanding at this point of how to answer the multiple choice questions. There will be one SAQ, there will be 25 multiple choice questions in one SAQ. So let's get right into it. We're going to start with the elite industrialists. These were the, robber barons or captains of industry, we might call them. This was an extreme form of wealth that I will mention that is a very small percentage of Americans, and they gained their extreme wealth through monopolies. They were often looked at as either the captains of industry, the best of their time, or sometimes robber barons because of the way they treated their workers, because of the measures that they took to gain their wealth. These are people like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie as well. I want to talk a little bit more about Andrew Carnegie in his book, The Gospel of Wealth. He talked about the social and moral responsibility of the rich to administer their wealth to the poor, especially through education programs and art programs, because of these social Darwinist ideas. Now, I want to expand on that just a little bit, that Carnegie truly believed that people, especially immigrants, the poor, didn't know enough, weren't smart enough, didn't have the drive or the motivation enough themselves to gain that wealth. And so he looked at it as this group of people like himself, these philanthropists, as the ones who needed to do it for others because they weren't good enough to do it or smart enough to do it themselves. So it was very much of a social Darwinist idea. Although it was a good one, and he was very philanthropic, it came from perhaps a ingenuine kind of idea. This was a big time of social reformation. There were very wide gaps between the rich and the poor. While there is an increase in the middle class, the poor were really poor at this time and the rich were very rich. It prompted social change and some government interaction. Now, like all of the social reforms that we've seen throughout the different periods of U.S. history, it always started with individuals and people before the government got on board. So I do mention social government interaction, but know that it always started first with individuals in society or small groups in society. Social reformation was done through things like settlement houses, employment help. There was some political reform. So people like Jacob Riis, he was a photojournalist who exposed the harshness of tenement housing. Remember, tenement housing is often like that high-rise housing, especially for the poor. There would be overcrowded, kind of dirty conditions. Most of the time, immigrants were those who were coming in and would live in these conditions, and they came to the cities in search of a better life. What Riis exposed was that people who were coming to these cities in search of a better life, immigrants, were actually finding conditions much worse than probably what they left. Settlement houses, the most famous is probably the Hull House in Chicago. It was started by Jane Addams, but women like Jane Addams were often like middle-class reformers, oftentimes women who wanted to truly help out immigrants, but in order to adjust to this kind of new life and culture. And these settlement houses were areas where immigrants especially could come to learn the language, to get some maybe financial assistance, but more like cultural assistance. The expansion of the West, this continuing theme that's happening through immigration. The expansion is happening through immigration, through things like the Homestead Act, which we've mentioned several times now, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, an increased movement west in search of a better life. Cities became overcrowded. People always kind of had this need to move west, but it often, like we've seen over and over, it led to competitions between whites and Native Americans. The Turner Thesis came out at this time, and the Turner Thesis was all about this idea that American democracy was formed by the frontier, like this rugged individualism. And it really justified a push for imperialism because the frontier was closed. Turner said there was no more frontier left. What was going to be found was found, keeping in mind that there were definitely thousands of, maybe hundreds of thousands of Native Americans living there. Yet to Turner, this was a good way to justify an expansion of not only the West, but really even further beyond the borders. Political machines were a very important topic during this time. These political machines were the small group of political leaders that ran the government, especially in cities, but they aimed their kind of efforts at the most vulnerable, especially immigrants, where they would get immigrants' votes in exchange for like housing and employment. Sometimes not live up to their end of the bargain, but that's how political machines operated. Boss Tweed might have been probably the most famous political boss. He was a corrupt New York City political boss of Tammany Hall. He swindled the city out of millions for his own benefit and never really giving it back to those housing opportunities or that employment opportunity for, the immigrants that he promised when he got the vote. Labor unions were often in conflict against political machines because these workers, many labor unions unified workers. It was a workers' movement to combat the unfair practices against big business and the fat cats of those political machines. Oftentimes political machines, like the Boss Tweeds, if you will, knew how to kind of get on the good side of the big industrialists, of the wealthy, but they also knew how to entice immigrants who were very, very vulnerable and maybe didn't know any better and perhaps naive. And so labor unions eventually formed to combat both the political machines and the big business, the elite industrialists and monopolies. Immigration is another big theme. This is happening two places primarily, in Southern and Eastern Europe, and also in China, coming from Asia at these times. Culturally, the immigrants coming from South and East Europe at this time were very different from the immigrants that had come a generation earlier from France, not so much France, but I'd say Ireland and Germany. Those immigrants were more like the white immigrant that you might have thought of before. So now it was not so much of a nativist movement as an assimilationist movement, especially the second generation. The second generation immigrant felt this need to very much assimilate and blend into the culture. This was somewhat helped through the settlement houses, but typically immigrants had to live in segregated parts of the city. They almost always lived in cities, typically tenement houses, and in these kind of cultural neighborhoods. The Carlisle Indian School, again, this kind of measure to assimilate people, Native Americans especially. It was aimed to assimilate and kill the Indian, save the man. That was Richard Henry Pratt's famous logo. Like, in order to save Native Americans, we got to take all the Indianness out of them. And he felt that could be done in boarding schools. Children were really actually forced to learn English, Christian views, kind of these American customs. However, if you read even that last bit of documents that I had asked you to read by Luther Standing Bearer, there was a deep distrust of white Americans by Native Americans, completely stemming from the broken treaties that had happened over the time. And so this distrust of whites basically made Native Americans want to completely reject these Indian schools and any type of American culture, simply because of the distrust. And so Indian schools probably had the opposite effect of what they originally wanted to do. The Dawes Act was an important part at this time, and what I want you to remember is the Dawes Act was really meant to break up this whole tribal system, just like the Indian schools. Get away from your tribal ways, of the ways of knowing, of being with people that you know, and customs that you know, and start living like a farmer. So this allotment of reservation land was given to Native Americans to farm in order to civilize them, in quotations, and then eventually grant citizenship. Now that took a long time to prove that you were worthy to be an American citizen. And in return then, the Dawes Act hoped that people would become absorbed into that American culture and leave their tribal heritage behind. It didn't really work, partly because the Dawes Act was set up for failure. Secondly, people felt very isolated and alone, and Native American tribes are very communal in their understanding. So this was completely foreign to what Native Americans would have understood. And so the Dawes Act was another dismal failure, meant to break up the tribal system. William Jennings Bryan wrote his famous Cross of Gold speech. Remember, he was the populist, which was a kind of a Democratic offshoot. He was the candidate who gave this speech about supporting the free silver movement. Remember, they wanted to add silver in order to inflate the prices, because farmers were feeling the effects of higher prices everywhere, and they couldn't combat those big, especially like the railroad. And so he gave this speech to really aid in lowering farmers' debt that had resulted from the economic downturns, especially of 1893, but a little bit of 1873 as well. Basically, William Jennings Bryan felt like they needed to add silver to the coinage, to the economic system, because railroads and big businesses were to blame for farmers' downturn. Now, this is in 1896, and so we do see prices inflate, but it's not enough to really help commodity prices for farmers. And then there's discrimination after the Civil War. A lot of people migrated in search of a better opportunity to escape those Jim Crow laws, but when I say a lot, don't think like it's a mass exodus or a mass migration. We do see some instances like Pat Singleton and the Exodusters who leave, but there's still entrenched deeply this divide in American social racial understanding. It does not help that Plessy versus Ferguson comes out in 1896 and basically says that separate but equal is absolutely constitutional. It could have totally reversed the Jim Crow laws, but in fact it strengthened it. And so we will now, from this point onward, until Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned in another 55 years or so, we will see a deepening divide of racial systems where, for instance, they'll say, well, it's equal because you have the same amount of, say, police resources, when maybe in a certain neighborhood those resources are subpar, meaning police don't have access to transportation, to cars, to some of the same things that could protect society the way police are supposed to, that perhaps a white neighborhood would. So Plessy versus Ferguson was not 2 steps back in racial progress, it was more like 4 steps back in racial progress. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was in 1882. It ended immigration from Asia, and again, it was very much of a racial stop to immigration happening, coming from processing in at Angel Island. We've talked about Ellis Island, where most of the processing stations happened out in New York. In California, it's Angel Island, and it was really just this racial program. It was only supposed to last for 10 years, and it continued to be to go on and on. after basically Chinese immigrants helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, the western side of it, Chinese were willing to take jobs that other maybe Americans weren't willing to take, especially during the gold rush. But when these financial downturns happen, it's a good way to justify why they have to stop immigration from China, even though immigration from China was very small in comparison to immigration from other areas like Southern Europe or Eastern Europe. So that's it. We will meet tomorrow and do a little bit more review. See you then.